In these days, when I've got tens of gigabytes literally hanging off my house keys, it can be hard to imagine a time when I got excited over the prospect of having 100 megabytes of data with me in my college bag. But today, we're going to take a trip back to the 90s to experience the Iomega Zip Drive. And I'm in my early 40s now, and it's fair to say, storage has changed a hell of a lot in my lifetime. When I got my first computer, the default storage on that machine was the Commodore Dataset cassette tape recorder, and I can still vividly remember opening my Commodore Plus 4 on Christmas morning of 1987, and the first thing I opened was actually a big collection of cassette tapes. And at the time, I didn't even know that computer games came on tape. Originally, I thought these were audio story cassette tapes until I opened the computer and then it twigged. But back then, I always dreamed of owning a disk drive, but in the late 80s, the 5.25-inch floppy drive was actually more expensive than the computer itself, and I didn't know any of my friends who owned a floppy drive then. It was cassette tapes all the way. And that all changed when I got my Amiga 500 Plus for Christmas of 1991, with a whopping 880K stored on one of its futuristic-looking 3.5-inch floppy disks. And back then, I thought I was never going to fill these disks. Almost a megabyte of information on each floppy, and of course, I was completely wrong. It wasn't long before games were coming shipped on 15 floppy disks. And then a couple of years later, I discovered the World Wide Web, when we got free access to it at school and then college. And with internet access came the joys of file downloading, particularly a service called Aminet. Now at the time, this was the world's biggest archive of free software, and it was all for the Amiga. And this site still exists today, it's still going strong 25 years later. But I soon found out how quickly I could fill up a floppy disk downloading software at college to take home, and I'd regularly have to split and rejoin files across several disks, and then that would usually lead to errors with certain parts of a disk having corruption when I tried to rejoin the files at home. Not great when all I wanted to do was check out those new scene demos in all their glory. And then one day, the answer to all my problems came along, and it was packaged in a very cool looking blue case, and it's this, the Iomega Zip Drive. Now, I recently found this old zip drive lurking at the bottom of my wardrobe, so I thought we'd rediscover the experience of using a zip drive together. And if you're not familiar with them, or you just need a bit of a reminder, these futuristic, at least for the time, looking drives came in various form factors and connections, but this is a version that I had, and it let me move 100 megabytes of data between the computer lab and my machine at home, using these special disks, which at first glance seem a lot sturdier and rugged than a standard floppy disk. And before the age of USB disks or even affordable CD writing, the zip drive was a very popular addition to computer setups from the mid to late 1990s. Pretty affordable at around $199, and here in the UK, the discs went for around £15 to £20 each. And you could buy a zip drive in various models with different interfaces. Initially, they made internal IDE versions of the zip drive that were pre-mounted in some machines, most famously the Apple Power Mac range, where you could add an optional internal zip drive. You could get SCSI versions of them and parallel port drives as well, of which this is one, although internally it is just a SCSI zip drive with a parallel to SCSI adapter fitted inside. And later, they even made USB and FireWire versions of high-capacity zip drives. And whenever you saw one of these on a desk, they definitely stood out next to the standard beige computers of the 1990s. And actually, they reminded me more of the look of something like a Silicon Graphics workstation, with their dark blue case and rubber feet on the side, so that meant you could orientate the drive either horizontally, or, if you're a bit tight on desk space, it could sit vertically too. And the power plug is quite a nice design on these drives as well. The power supply connector actually goes in at a right angle, and then you feed the power cable through this cutout. So that means it looks very tidy on the desk and makes it a bit more difficult to accidentally pull out the cord at the wrong time. And we've got a clear window at the top of the drive so you can see if a disc is inserted, and there is a mechanical eject mechanism, so when you push the disc in, it will click in place, and then you click on the little round eject button and it will spit the disc out. And on the front here we've got power and activity LEDs stylishly embedded into the top of the case as well. And taking a closer look at zip disks themselves, now often new disks would come in a plastic case to protect the disk, but actually they probably didn't really need it, as inside you can see the disk itself, and if you ever used a 3.5-inch floppy, these do feel a lot tougher. And these initial zip disks were advertised as holding 100 megabytes of data, but of course to use them you had to format them on your machine, and after the file system was on them you generally had around 97 megabytes available for your files. And on the front is a nice big label section, like a floppy disk, where you can write the title for this volume. And there is a metal access shutter, which the drive opens when you insert it. But unlike floppy disks, where you could open the disk shutter and see the magnetic medium inside, it is actually a bit harder to get to in a zip drive, meaning that it's less likely to open and get corrupted in your bag or your pocket. So next, we'll get this hooked up to my old Pentium PC and check out the Iomega Zip Drive experience using Windows 95. And just before we hop into that part of the video, you might have heard about VPNs before, and they can help you protect your privacy. And one really useful feature is they can make it seem like you're connecting from other parts of the world. And of course that means you can access content that is usually region specific on the popular streaming platforms. And with over 5,500 servers in 59 countries, NordVPN unlocks it all. And for security, NordVPN comes highly recommended. They offer double encryption technology, meaning your internet traffic goes via 2 VPN servers, the second of which is completely unaware of your original IP address. So that is perfect to give you extra protection when traveling, when you're on public Wi-Fi, in coffee shops, hotels, or the airport. And NordVPN is so quick, you can leave it on in the background and forget about it. You don't even realize that you've got it on. And in the background, it will improve your online experience with their CyberSec suite, which will block ads, protect you from malware and other online threats. And NordVPN have been kind enough to support my channel, so if you enjoy my content, why don't you support them back and take advantage of this incredible offer? Head to my unique link that you'll see on screen right now, nordvpn.com/danwood, and you can get NordVPN's 2-year plan with 4 extra months for free. And it's completely risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. Right then, so we've got the parallel cable hooked into my Pentium 1 PC. Now, I've got to admit the one that's included is quite short, so I've used a parallel extender cable so I can put the drive on the table here. And it comes with a selection of setup disks on a floppy. Now, the thing is, you don't actually need any drivers if you're using this on Windows 98, as they actually included a zip driver in the OS. But for Windows 95, we'll need to run the setup program. So leave that to do its thing for a couple of minutes, a quick reboot later, and then going into my computer, we can now see an icon for the zip drive. And really installing it is as simple as that. And using zip drives, well, as you'd expect, it's really like using a big floppy disk. But the disk drive itself is very quiet in operation. Unlike a floppy drive, we haven't got any noisy drive heads or anything like that. All we hear is a very gentle whir while the drive is running. And I'm not going to spend ages and bore you by going through my entire zip disk collection of old college and school work, as I imagine that's not really of interest to anyone but maybe me. But it is quite interesting for me to see that most of the documents that I've saved from my school and college days are actually in plain text format. And the reason for that is that I would actually write most of these at home using something like Wordworth on the Amiga, and then I would save them as a plain text file to load them into Microsoft Office on the Windows 95 RM Nimbus machines that we had in the computer lab, and then I could print them off on the laser printers or finish off the work there, and vice versa. If I started something at college, I would generally save it as a text file to then load into my Amiga when I got home. And it is quite funny and quite cringeworthy to look back on my English homework to see some of these short fiction stories that I wrote when I was a teenager, one of which appears to be a total rip-off of the story and introduction of the game Another World. And luckily it turns out my English teacher wasn't much of a gamer, so I think I got away with that. And on this first zip disk, I've also got a directory full of HTML downloads on here. And this is something that I do regularly before I got the internet at home, because we could only book out the internet in 1-hour slots. So I'd use it to download as many HTML pages onto my zip drive as I could in an hour, and then I'd wait till I got home to read them all offline using a web browser on my Amiga. So rather than wasting that precious 1 hour reading articles on the web, or often humour posts, I'd download a hell of a lot of those cheesy humour lists back in the day. I'd then read them at my own leisure in the evening or on the weekend. And there's a bunch of images I downloaded from the web in the mid-90s on this zip disk as well. And it turns out that even back then, I was still very much into my retro stuff, even though these machines were only about a decade old at this point. And there's pictures of old Commodore computers on here, even unreleased systems like the Commodore 65. And of course, being the 90s, there is some Spice Girls images on here as well. Although looking at these ones, they don't look all that complimentary. I think these pictures were downloaded from an anti-Spice Girls website. Yeah, I wasn't a big fan as a teenager. And interestingly, I found some PC programs on this zip disk, and this is actually a nice little time capsule of some of the programs I was using when I got my first PC back in the late 90s. Now, by now, I was at college and we had internet access full-time in the computer lab, and it was a lot quicker than the 56k modem that I had at home, and of course it was free as well. So what I'd do is I'd often download programs from the web at college and then install them from my zip drive when I got home. And one thing I always heard about zip disks back in the day was how unreliable they were. And if they did fail, I do vividly remember this only happened once or twice to me, but I would get the dreaded click of death when a disk had failed. But actually, I can't demo that in this video because all of these disks that I've tried appear to work just fine, even 25 years later. So maybe that fabled unreliability wasn't so much of an issue after all. Now, I've gone through quite a few of these discs, and there's not really much on here after the turn of the millennium. By then, I had a CD writer in my machine, and the zip drive got packed away. And I've seen the zip drive included on lists of failed media formats in more recent years, but I don't think the zip drive was a failure at all. In fact, I think this was a revolution for a few years. I mean, this was really the first time that the average computer user had access to portable, reliable, and relatively high capacity storage that could be carried around easily in your pocket or your bag. And obviously that paved the way for the USB sticks that we all have today. So I hope you enjoyed this brief look back at the Iomega Zip Drive, and if you've got any memories of using zip drives, of course, I'd love to hear a comment from you on this video. And just a quick reminder that I also do a weekly retro gaming and technology podcast. With new episodes released every Friday, we bring you up to speed on all the big news stories from the world of retro from over the last week, and we bring you an interview with a veteran of the industry on the show each week. So you can get it from your favourite podcast client or head to our website at theretrohour.com. And while you're here on YouTube, here are another couple of my videos I think you might enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.